of minutes when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other two sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense because, I mean, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other 2 boys and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Pankman and they hailed the police, and very quickly a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other 2 boys about, what did you hear? You know, you had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you and he was within earshot of you, certainly. You know, what did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other 2 boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby was missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles. And it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. And it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing. And it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog. And again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby. One, there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And 2, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there. And there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there's no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there were drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. And whatever it did, it probably wasn't good.
What do you say, drone? Ready to stretch your wings?
Wait, Sova. Wait. Wait.
Don't hold back.
Specs here.
Let's go.
Chop that.
What the fuck?
Enemy spawn is made.
Silence.
They're dead.
Scanning ahead. Found them.
Last player standing. One enemy remaining. Thirty seconds left.
New fight, new tactics, keep it fresh, yeah?
In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold, there might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful, and our stuff's getting wet, and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside, And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground and protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they